She signed her name to the marriage contract before she had even seen his face, because the alternative was 5 more years scrubbing workhouse floors under Josiah Slocum's ledger of debts that never seemed to shrink no matter how much she paid against them. And Ada Fenwick had decided, watching her own hand write Ellis Trapp's name beside hers, that a stranger's silence could not possibly be worse than the noise of that place. "He don't talk much," the parish reverend had warned her, arranging the match through the charity register that placed workhouse women with frontier men desperate enough not to mind their circumstances. "Some say he's touched, since his wife passed. I'd not have you go in ignorant of the talk, Miss Fenwick, whatever else I think of the man myself." "I've lived 3 years under Mr. Slocum's ledger," Ada had said. "I expect I can manage a quiet husband." She had entered that workhouse at 15, orphaned when a fever took both her parents inside the same terrible week, with no aunt or uncle willing to take in a girl who came with no dowry and no useful connections. And she had spent the 8 years since learning exactly how little the world valued a woman with nothing behind her name. She scrubbed floors. She mended linens for families richer than she would ever be. She watched girls she'd grown up beside marry out of the place, or more often, grow old inside it, worn thin by Slocum's endless ledger of debts that seemed to regenerate faster than any woman could pay them down. When the parish reverend came round with his charity register of frontier men seeking wives, most of the workhouse women had refused outright, unwilling to trade one uncertain servitude for another sight unseen. Ada alone had asked to see the full list, reasoning that a stranger's silence, however unsettling the rumors made it sound, could not possibly cage her more thoroughly than Slocum's arithmetic already had. She married Ellis Trapp on a Tuesday morning in the parish chapel, with 4 strangers as witnesses, and no family of her own to stand beside her, and rode out to Hollow Creek that same afternoon with everything she owned in a single trunk and a wedding band still unfamiliar on her finger, wondering the whole dusty way what manner of man waited at the end of the road, and whether silence, whatever its cause, might prove kinder than the noise she was leaving behind. She had not expected, stepping off the wagon at Hollow Creek into a yard gone gold with late summer grass, to find Ellis Trapp so large and so still, a man built like something carved rather than born, watching her arrival from beside the barn with an expression she could not read at all, not unkindness. She decided after a moment, but a carefulness so complete it looked, to a stranger, like nothing. "Mrs. Trapp," he said, and it was the whole of his greeting, 3 words offered like a man setting down something fragile. And then he took her single trunk in one arm as though it weighed nothing, and carried it toward the house, leaving her to follow or not as she chose. She followed. She had come a long way to follow. The house was clean but spare, a widower's house, every surface bearing the particular emptiness of rooms that had once held more life than they did now. Ada set herself to filling it the only way she knew, with work, with order, with the small, fierce competence that had kept her alive through years of institutional cruelty. And Ellis watched her do it with a silence so constant that by the end of her first week, she had begun to wonder whether the Reverend's warning had understated the truth of him. He was not unkind. She understood that quickly enough, in the careful way he split extra kindling before she'd thought to ask, in the way he left a wildflower once on the kitchen table without comment and never once mentioned having done it, as though the gesture would embarrass them both if spoken aloud. But he answered her questions in single words when he answered at all, ate his meals with his eyes fixed on his plate, and retreated most evenings to the barn long after dark. And Ada, lying awake in the bed he had given over to her while he slept in the loft, began to wonder what exactly had silenced a man so thoroughly that even gratitude came out of him like something rationed. Church that first Sunday taught her the shape of the town's suspicion, before it taught her the shape of her husband's grief. Word had traveled ahead of her, as word always did in small places, that Ellis Trapp had sent to a workhouse for a bride, and the congregation of Hollow Creek's little clapboard church regarded her across the aisle with a wary, assessing curiosity that reminded Ada uncomfortably of Slocum's own ledger-keeping eyes, as though she were a debt they had not yet decided whether to honor. "A workhouse woman," she heard one matron murmur to another, not quite out of earshot, "wed to a man half the county already calls touched. What sort of match is that, I ask you, but two broken things pretending to mend each other?" Ada said nothing in answer, having learned long ago that arguing with gossip only fed it, but she felt the words lodge somewhere tender regardless. And it was Ellis, beside her in the pew, silent as ever through the whole service, who surprised her afterward by steering her firmly toward the churchyard rather than hurrying her home as she'd expected a man so private to do. "Let them look," he said low, the first words he'd offered her all morning. "Looking's free. I'd not have you hide from it, Ada, not on my account." It was not much, as declarations went, but it was the first time since her arrival that he had spoken to defend rather than simply to answer, and Ada carried the small warmth of it home with her like a coal banked carefully against the cold. She learned the shape of it from Otis Granger, the nearest neighbor, a garrulous old rancher who rode over inside the first fortnight ostensibly to welcome her, and in truth to satisfy his own curiosity about the woman who'd married Hollow Creek's silent widower. His wife died birthing there first, Otis told her, not unkindly, over coffee Ada had poured with hands that did not quite want to hold steady. Storm came in sudden, roads washed out, and Ellis was 2 hours getting the doctor back, and by the time he did it was already too late for either of them, mother and babe both. He hasn't been the same man since. Used to be a talker, Ellis Trapp, before that night. Now you'll get 3 words out of him where you once got 30, and folks around here have decided that means he's touched, or cursed, or worse, though I've never believed it myself. Grief does strange things to a man's tongue same as it does to his heart. He blames himself, Ada said, understanding arriving all at once, cold and clear. Blames himself entire, Otis agreed. Reckons if he'd ridden faster, or known the road better, or not gone at all and sent a hand instead, his wife would be alive. I've told him 100 times a storm's no man's fault, but grief doesn't listen to arithmetic, Mrs. Trapp, no more than it listens to reason. Ada thought of her own years in Slocum's workhouse, the particular silence that descended on women there too, women who had learned that speaking of their griefs only invited more cruelty, and understood Ellis Trapp's silence not as strangeness, but as a language she already knew fluently, having spoken it herself for 3 long years. She did not press him in the weeks that followed. She simply worked alongside him where she could, mending fence, keeping accounts, tending the garden she coaxed back to life from years of neglect, and let her own presence say what her words could not yet reach him to say, that she did not need him talkative to find him worth staying for. It was over a broken axle, 3 weeks in, that he first spoke more than a handful of words to her at once. The wagon wheel had cracked on the rutted road back from town, and Ellis, kneeling in the dust to assess the damage, found Ada already crouched beside him with tools she'd apparently thought to bring, holding the broken spoke steady without being asked while he worked. "You've done this before," he said, surprised into more words than he'd offered in a week entire. "Workhouses aren't only for scrubbing floors," Ada said. "Mr. Slocum found it cheaper to have us mend what broke than replace it. I've fixed worse than a wagon wheel, Mr. Trapp, with worse tools than these." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way he had not quite allowed himself since her arrival, and something in his carved, careful face shifted, not quite a smile, but the loosening that precedes one. "Ellis," he said, "you might use my name if we're mending wheels together." "Ellis," Ada said, and found she liked the shape of it, plain and solid, the way she was coming to find him plain and solid too, in ways that had nothing to do with silence or strangeness, and everything to do with a steadiness she had not known in years. He took her, some days later, to the small fenced plot behind the north pasture, where his wife and infant son lay buried beneath a modest stone he had carved himself, and stood beside the graves, in a silence so heavy Ada understood it as an invitation rather than a dismissal, the closest thing to an unlocked door he had offered her yet. "I don't bring anyone out here," he said finally, staring at the stone rather than at her. "Otis has asked to come pay respects a dozen times. I've never let him. Don't rightly know why I'm letting you." "Perhaps because I understand what it is to visit a grave and still feel the debt of it unpaid," Ada said quietly. "I visited my own parents' plot for years, feeling I owed them a life I wasn't managing to live. It eased some when I stopped believing grief was a bill that wanted settling." Ellis was quiet a long while, the wind moving soft through the pasture grass around them. "I've believed it was for 4 years now," he admitted at last. "Believed if I just stayed quiet enough, sorry enough, it might count for something, might make up for not riding fast enough that night." His jaw worked once hard before the rest came. "It hasn't made up for anything, Ada. Just made me lonelier is all, and left this house quieter than my wife would ever have wanted it kept." "Then let it be loud again," Ada said, and reached for his hand there among the graves, an offering rather than a demand. "Not to forget her. Never that. Only so the house has room for living in, same as it has room for remembering." He did not answer in words that day, but he did not let go of her hand on the walk back to the house either, and Ada understood that some answers arrived slower than others, and were no less true for the waiting. The trouble found them before autumn did. Josiah Slocum arrived at Hollow Creek on a gray morning in a hired buggy, a thin, sharp-faced man whose ledgers had governed half of Ada's adult life, and the sight of him in her new yard sent a cold dread through her that had nothing to do with Ellis's silence, and everything to do with 3 years of remembered cruelty. "Mrs. Trapp," Slocum said, with the particular oily courtesy he reserved for those he believed still owed him something, "I've come about an outstanding matter. Your indenture bond, signed upon your entry to the workhouse 8 years past, was not discharged upon your marriage. The parish register handles placements, Mrs. Trapp, not debts, and your bond remains unpaid $40, by my accounting, plus accrued interest these 8 years. I'll take payment now, or I'll take you back to work it off, marriage certificate or no." "There is no such bond," Ada said, though her voice shook with old, remembered fear. "I signed papers of indenture as a girl of 15 with no family to advise me otherwise, and I have worked 3 years past what any honest ledger would call fair payment for a roof and gruel." "The ledger says otherwise," Slocum said, producing a paper she recognized with sick familiarity, columns of figures she had never been permitted to verify herself, numbers that had grown and grown across the years like something designed never to reach zero. $40, Mrs. Trapp, or I'll have the sheriff's assistance in collecting my property." Ellis, who had said perhaps a dozen words to Ada across the whole of that morning, stepped between his wife and Josiah Slocum with a stillness that carried more weight than any shout. "She's no one's property," Ellis said. "She's my wife." "Marriage doesn't discharge a lawful debt, Mr. Trapp, whatever sentiment you prefer," Slocum said, unmoved. $40, or I return in 1 week's time with the sheriff and the papers to collect what's owed, one way or the other. I'd advise you find the money, or find your wife a new husband willing to pay it, since I understand you're not a man of many resources yourself, judging by the state of this place." He left the false ledger behind, folded on the porch rail like a threat made physical, and rode off in his hired buggy. And Ada stood in the yard shaking with a fear she had thought she'd left behind at the workhouse gates forever. "He has no true claim," she told Ellis, once the dust of Slocum's departure had settled. "The bond he showed you, I never saw those figures before today. He forges his ledgers, Ellis. I've suspected it for years, padding the debts of women with no one to check his arithmetic and nowhere else to go. But suspecting it and proving it to a sheriff, who's likely on Slocum's payroll besides, are different matters entirely." "Then we prove it," Ellis said, and there was a steel in his quiet voice she had not heard before, the sound of a man who had spent years absorbing his own grief in silence, and had just discovered something worth breaking that silence to protect. $40 I don't have, not free and clear, not without selling stock I can't spare before winter. But proof I can find, if it exists to be found." That same evening, unbeknownst to Ada, Ellis rode into town alone and offered the mercantile owner his late wife's small gold locket, the one keepsake of hers he had kept all these years in a drawer he rarely opened, in exchange for enough cash to cover Slocum's demand outright should prove impossible to gather in time. It was Otis Granger, encountering him coming out of the mercantile, hollow-eyed and grim, who talked him out of the sale before it could be completed. "You'll not sell that locket, Ellis Trapp, not for Slocum, not for anyone," Otis said, plain and firm. "Give your wife, the living one, the chance to fight this her own way first. She's proven twice over already she's no woman who needs rescuing without her say in the matter. Trust her before you trade away the one thing of Margaret's you've got left." Ellis had gone home that night with the locket still in his pocket, and a new, uncomfortable understanding of how close he had come to solving Ada's trouble in exactly the manner she'd spent her whole life fighting against decided for her, without her voice in it. And it was that understanding, more than anything, that steadied him to wait, however hard the waiting sat, until she rode back through the gate 3 days later with the truth folded against her heart. Word of Slocum's visit reached Hollow Creek's small community faster than either of them expected, carried by Otis Granger, who had happened by in time to see the buggy departing, and drew his own conclusions from Ada's shaken face. What Ada had not anticipated was how the town would respond, not with the suspicion she'd feared a workhouse woman's past might earn her, but with a quiet, gathering outrage on her behalf that surprised her more than Slocum's threat had. "Half this county's got a sister or a cousin who passed through that man's workhouse," Otis told her grim, over the kitchen table, where half a dozen neighbors had gathered inside 2 days of the news spreading, drawn by loyalty to Ellis, and increasingly by their own growing regard for the quiet, capable woman he'd married. "I'd wager every one of us has heard some version of Slocum's arithmetic before. Man's built half his fortune padding debts of folk with no one to check his figures." "Then let's check them," said Constance Whitfield, the schoolteacher, who had brought with her a satchel of her own bookkeeping skill, and an old grievance against Slocum dating back to her own sister's time in his ledgers. "If he's forging bonds, there'll be a pattern to it, and patterns can be proven, Mrs. Trapp, if we can lay hands on his true records rather than the ones he carries around to frighten women with." The same women who had murmured about broken things pretending to mend each other in the churchyard weeks before arrived at Hollow Creek within days, not with gossip this time, but with contributions toward the $40 Slocum demanded, in case proof could not be gathered fast enough to matter a few coins from the postmaster's wife, a length of good wool from the mercantile owner, small offerings pressed into Ada's hands with an awkward, unpracticed kindness that undid her more thoroughly than any cruelty ever had. We were wrong to whisper what we whispered, the matron who'd spoken loudest in church admitted stiffly, refusing to quite meet Ada's eyes. A woman who'd ride into a mending like this one, fence posts and gardens and all, oughtn't have had to prove herself twice over just for where she came from. "I'm sorry for it," Mrs. Trapp plainly said. "Then we'll call it settled," Ada said, and found she meant it, understanding better than most how much courage plain apology required of proud people. It was Ada herself, 3 days later, who found the proof, riding into the county seat under cover of an ordinary supply trip, and calling upon the one clerk at the workhouse she trusted, a young man named Peter Nash, who had always treated the women there with more decency than his position required, and who, at Ada's quiet request, agreed to let her see the original bond she'd signed as a frightened girl of 15. The number on that original paper was $11, not 40. Slocum's copy, the one he'd waved in Ellis's yard, bore figures inflated fourfold, in ink Peter Nash confirmed was fresher than the original by years. "He does it to nearly all of them," Peter admitted, low, clearly frightened of his own honesty, but unwilling in the end to withhold it. "Pads the sums after they've left, banking on them having no copy of their own and no standing to argue a rich man's ledger. I've wanted to speak against it for years and never had the nerve. I'll swear to what I've seen, Mrs. Trapp, if it comes to that. You were kind to me once, my first month there, when no one else was. I've not forgotten it." Ada rode home with the original bond folded against her heart like something holy, and found Ellis waiting in the yard at dusk, having watched the road since noon with a worry he did not bother hiding from her, which told her, more than any words could, how much had shifted in him since Slocum's visit. "I have it," she said, before he could ask, pressing the paper into his hands. $11, Ellis, not 40, and a clerk willing to swear to the forgery in front of any judge in the territory. Ellis read the paper by the last of the daylight, and something in his broad shoulders eased that had been carrying tension since the morning Slocum first rode into his yard. "You did this yourself," he said. "Rode 2 counties and back in a day, and never once told me you meant to." "I've spent my whole life being spoken for by men who claimed to know my interests better than I did," Ada said. "I wasn't about to let this be settled the same way, Ellis, not even by a husband I've come to trust as much as I've come to trust you." Something in his face at that admission trust, spoken plainly, the first time either of them had named the thing growing quietly between them, made him reach for her hand with a tenderness that had nothing tentative left in it. "I've been a poor talker since my wife died," he said, low, the words clearly costing him something even now. "Told myself silence was penance for not riding fast enough the night she needed me. But you rode 2 counties today to fight a battle that wasn't even yours to fight, and never once needed me to say a word about it to know you'd done right. I find I don't want to be silent with you anymore, Ada. I find I've got things worth saying, after all, if you'll have the patience to hear a man out of practice saying them." "I've got nothing but patience," Ada said, her own voice unsteady now. "I've spent 3 years learning it in a place with precious little else to learn." He told her then of the locket he had nearly sold, and the shame that still sat with him at how close he'd come to deciding her rescue for her without a word of her own in it. "I'm glad Otis stopped you," Ada said, not unkindly, "though I understand why you thought of it. You wanted to spare me the fight. But I'd rather stand beside a man who trusts me to carry my own battles than one who carries them for me out of love alone, however well meant. There's a difference, Ellis, and I've learned it the hard way, same as most things I know." "I'm learning it now," Ellis said, "a mite slower than I'd like, but learning it all the same." Slocum returned exactly 1 week later, as promised, with the county sheriff riding beside him, and the same forged ledger in hand, confident enough in his own long practice of intimidation that he did not trouble to hide his satisfaction at the prospect of collecting his due. $40, Mr. Trapp, Slocum said, or I'll have the sheriff's assistants escorting your wife back to the workhouse to work off the balance, as the law allows for an unpaid indenture. There is no unpaid indenture, Ellis said, and his voice carried across the whole yard now, strong and unhesitating in a way that made Ada's chest ache with pride even amid her fear. Because the bond you're waiving is a forgery, Mr. Slocum. 4 times the sum my wife actually signed for as a frightened girl of 15, with no one to protect her interests. I've got the original bond here, in her own hand, and the workhouse registers, showing $11, long since paid 3 times over in labor no ledger of yours ever credited fairly. And I've got a clerk willing to swear before this sheriff, and any judge in the territory that you've padded bonds like hers for years, banking on women with nowhere else to turn, and no copy of their own to argue with. Peter Nash, who had ridden out that morning at Ada's quiet request, stepped forward from where he'd been waiting inside the house, pale but resolute, and repeated to the sheriff exactly what he'd told Ada 3 days before: the pattern of inflated sums, the fresher ink, the years of women too frightened or too powerless to question a rich man's arithmetic. The sheriff, who had ridden out expecting a simple debt collection, and found instead the makings of a fraud that implicated half the indentures Slocum had ever issued, looked at the original bond, looked at Peter Nash's steady testimony, and looked, finally, at Josiah Slocum's face, which had gone the particular gray of a man watching his whole careful scheme come apart in front of witnesses he could not silence. "I'll be wanting your full ledgers, Mr. Slocum," the sheriff said grim, "and I expect the county judge will want them examined line by line before this is done. You'll not be collecting any debts from this household today, nor, I'd wager, from a good many others once word of this spreads." "This is outrageous," Slocum sputtered, looking between the sheriff's grim face and the ring of neighbors now visible at the yard's edge, his composure cracking for the first time since Ada had known him. "That clerk will lose his position for this slander. I've run that workhouse 11 years without a single complaint upheld against me." "Without a single complaint upheld," Peter Nash said, some new courage steadying his voice now that the words were finally out, "because you made certain no woman who left ever had a copy of her own bond to compare against yours, and no man of standing ever thought to ask a workhouse clerk whether the ledgers he kept were honest ones. I've watched you pad sums for 11 years too, Mr. Slocum, same as you have. I'll not watch it a 12th. Slocum's protests died in his throat as Otis Granger and 3 other neighbors, who had ridden over that morning at the first sign of the sheriff's approach, closed ranks quietly around the yard. Not with violence, none of them so much as raised a hand, but with the simple, immovable presence of a community that had decided, collectively, it would not stand by and watch one of its own dragged off by a fraud they now had every proof of. Slocum, seeing the numbers stacked so thoroughly against him, climbed back into his buggy with what dignity he could salvage and did not return to Hollow Creek again. And word reached them within the month that the county judge, presented with Peter Nash's testimony and a dozen other women's original bonds gathered in the weeks that followed, had stripped Slocum of the workhouse's management entirely and opened an inquiry into every indenture he had ever issued. Ada wept that evening, not from fear this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of watching a cruelty that had shaped half her life, finally called by its true name in front of witnesses who believed her. "It's over," Ellis said, holding her on the porch steps as the last of the neighbors' wagons rattled off down the road. "Truly over, Ada. No ledger left to hold over you forged or otherwise. I never thought I'd see him answer for it, Ada said. Not truly. I'd made my peace with simply escaping him and thought that would have to be enough. You didn't escape him, Ellis said. You beat him. There's a difference, and I'd have you know I noticed it, same as I noticed everything else about you since the day you climbed down off that wagon and started mending wheels and gardens, and this whole broken quiet house, without waiting to be asked. You noticed a great deal, Ada said, for a silent man. I'm finding I've got less use for silence than I thought, Ellis said, and there was warmth in his voice now, unhidden, the warmth of a man who had spent years believing himself sentenced to a quiet penance and had discovered instead a woman worth talking to. I loved my first wife, Ada, and I'll not pretend that grief away for anyone's comfort, not even yours. But I find there's room in a mended heart for more than one love, same as there's room in a quiet man for more words than he thought he had left in him. I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I was out of practice saying true things aloud. Then practice, Ada said, laughing through tears, because I intend to want hearing it a great many more times before I'm through. He kissed her then, on the porch steps of the home she had married a stranger to escape a workhouse, and found, instead, entirely her own, not a temporary shelter from Slocum's ledger, but a true home, built slow and honest between two people who had each learned, in their separate griefs, the particular value of a silence finally broken by someone worth speaking to. In the seasons that followed, Hollow Creek came to know Ellis Trapp as a changed man, not loud, never that, but no longer silent in the way that had once worried his neighbors. A man who spoke plainly when it mattered, who thanked his wife aloud instead of only in wildflowers left wordless on the table, who had learned at last that some griefs ease not through penance, but through the slow, deliberate courage of letting someone else in. He took to walking with Ada out to the small, fenced plot behind the north pasture on Sunday afternoons, no longer a private penance kept from every eye but a quiet family habit, and left flowers there openly now, speaking to his first wife's memory in a voice Ada never once begrudged him, understanding that a heart large enough to hold two loves honestly was no failure of devotion, but the truest kind there was. The county judge's inquiry into Josiah Slocum's ledgers took the better part of a year to complete, and turned up, by its end, enough forged bonds and padded debts to see the workhouse placed under new, honest management, and Slocum himself barred from ever again holding another soul's finances in his keeping. Ada testified when asked, calm and unflinching in a courtroom that had once seemed as far beyond her reach as freedom itself, and walked out afterward on her husband's arm into a bright, ordinary afternoon that felt, for the first time in her whole life, entirely her own to spend as she pleased. And Ada, who had once signed her name to a stranger's contract only to escape a crueler one, found she had gained, in the bargain, not merely a home, but the truest kind of love, the kind that had waited, patient and quiet, for exactly the right woman to draw it back out into the light.